Well, I think with this, with the hour approaching, it's time for us to get started. So let me start by welcoming you, our audience. Thank you so much for coming to this webinar on Changing Politics, a Shifting Landscape and Election Reform Opportunities on both sides of the Atlantic. I'm really excited for the discussion that I'll be having with Darren Hughes, who is Chief Executive of the Electoral Reform Society. We're just going to give our audience members just a few more minutes to get logged in, and then we'll look forward to get started. And Darren, as we wait for our audience members to log in, I just want to note that I've done some reading on your reflections post the UK election and just found them very thoughtful. So thank you so much for that thought leadership.
I'm pleased to share them. That's just the beginning. I'm sure we have a lot more things to add as time goes on.
For sure.
And we're looking forward to reading your things at the end of the year as well.
Yes, it's a busy year for both of us for sure. But with that, perhaps we should go ahead and get started. Good afternoon to those of you here in the States, and to those of you joining us from the UK, good evening. I'm Meredith Sumpter. I'm the President and CEO of FairVote. And for those of you who may not be familiar with us or are joining us from across the Atlantic, FairVote is a nonpartisan organization that works to advance voting reforms to make democracy more functional and representative for every American. We focus on both ranked choice voting and proportional ranked choice voting, which you may know as preferential voting and single transferable vote. And this is all to give voters more choices, fairer representation, and better government. I'm so delighted to have you joining us for today's discussion, and I'd like to welcome my co-host, Darren Hughes, Chief Executive of the Electoral Reform Society, which I understand is the world's oldest democracy reform organization. Darren, do tell us more.
Well, thank you, Meredith. It's great to join you in the from here in London and the United Kingdom, speaking to many friends and supporters here, but also in the US as well. And we were formed in 1884 as an independent, non-partisan organisation. To try and bring reform to the electoral system, to try and put voters at the centre of voting rather than particular parties or candidates. And we've alighted on the idea of pursuing the single transferable vote as the system best suited for a multi-party democracy and multiple candidates, and the best chance to get more people involved. So we campaign on that issue for the House of Commons. We also campaign on reforming the second chamber to make it more democratically elected, and also to look at things like how we can get more diversity into our representation as well, which we think is just so important. So we work across the 4 nations of the UK, England, Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland, and we're really pleased to be having this conversation with you at this time.
Excellent. Well, we are certainly in an exciting and important year for democracy in both the United States and the United Kingdom. And we're gathering here today about 8 weeks after the UK's parliamentary election and exactly 10 weeks before the US presidential election. So both FairVote and the Electoral Reform Society, we have been leading the charge for election reforms that deliver value for voters. How is your government system working on behalf of those who are being governed? And this is really an opportunity for Darren and I to chat a bit about what's going on in our respective elections this year, the shared trends that we're seeing, as well as the possibilities for reform of election systems on both sides of the Atlantic. So I'm really looking forward to this conversation, and I hope you all are too. One just housekeeping note, we are recording this conversation. If you have questions for me and for Darren, please do place them in the Q&A box. You can find that at the bottom of your Zoom screen. Go ahead and do this at any time, and don't feel like you need to wait until the Q&A begins if you have a question that you think of earlier. So without further ado, shall we dive in? Excellent. All right. So Darren, I'd love if we could start at the beginning. For our friends who may not have been closely following the UK election on July 4th, given our own holiday on that date, what were the key takeaways for the Electoral Reform Society of the UK election?
Well, it was an election that we weren't expecting. We thought that once we got past the spring and May, that there wouldn't be a chance of the election being called until later in the year, into the autumn, or it could have legally gone until January, but we didn't think that was going to happen. Then suddenly it was called for July, and we were in a situation at that point where the country was going to the polls in a 6-week campaign. So what we looked at the end of when the votes came in was that it was the most disproportionate election that had ever been held. There were a result where the governing party, the winning party, the Labour Party, received 1/3 of the vote, but took 2/3 of the seats for a huge historic majority in the House of Commons. And there were also votes for multiple numbers of parties, but they didn't receive anywhere near the level of representation that they should have received had we had a fairer voting system. So the system has shown that the seats won't match votes, and that the difficulty with that is that the voter isn't getting fair representation for what they're trying to achieve in the election. And I think the other takeaway for us was that when people know the system's not going to work, they end up having to do things that are almost a contortion of democracy. They have to do things like tactical voting, for example. And in other words, they vote for the candidate that's not their favorite, but they're a better candidate than the one they dislike the most. Now, that's not a very positive experience of the voting system. And so what we would say to that is that if we had a fairer system, we wouldn't have to go through that example. And then finally, but voters are already acting as though we've got proportional representation because they are voting for more than just the two traditional parties. So the takeaway really is there's a lot of volatility. People are shifting around a lot, and a landslide in one cycle can result in a landslide the opposite way in the next. And party identification, where people just stick with one party for life, seems to have really been on the decline. So I think that's just some of the things we can take away. Seats aren't matching votes, and there really is a time to now say, after the most disproportionate result ever, we need to have a change in the voting system.
Oh, for sure. And one of the things that you touched on, that there is the increasing vote for smaller parties in the UK other than Labour and Conservative. We also see a record number of American voters that are identifying as independent, particularly among younger people. What do you think is driving this in the UK?
And I think there's several factors to it. One is that we've seen a real collapse in trust and support for institutions, which has been just so profound and pronounced as politics has changed in recent times. And that this has been had real effects on the way that politics is conducted, how candidates are treated, how the voters feel treated by the promises that are made, or the way that they are spoken to or see other people spoken to. And so I think that has really caused a chasm to emerge between the voter and the citizens with the institutions and with the notion of politics. And so that makes people think, whereas they might have voted consistently for one party most of their voting life, occasionally made a switch, and there'd be a small number of swing voters or marginal seat voters or battleground state voters to be chasing. Now we're seeing that people are regularly changing their votes, and they're looking for something different. They're shopping around. They don't want to be stuck with just one party. And this notion that the two larger parties in a first past the post majoritarian style system can be a home to all these voters just really isn't realistic anymore. And that's why the people are breaking out and they're voting for other parties and for independent candidates, even though they're taking a risk that their vote might not count. And I think that's what we really saw here. For example, 21% of voters, over 1 in 5 people, voted for either a party called Reform or a party called the Greens, two very different parties. But of that large vote share, they only got just over 1% of the seats in the House of Commons. So I think people are breaking away from those traditions, and the system just cannot cope with it by definition, which is why change is so desperately needed.
Oh, and for sure. And just that your comment, I mean, clearly voters are not satisfied with the establishment options, which, as you note, is driving this different change in voter behavior, even if they're at risk of not having their vote count, so to speak, in that first past the post system.
That's right. No, and it shouldn't be this difficult for the voter, right? The voting should be a pleasant, happy, easy experience for voters. We're kind of turning it into this massive operation that's contorted, that people have to do things that aren't following what they really genuinely want to do. And I think that's a real feature and a theme that's coming through. Often when there's an election analysis taking place, people focus and obsess about what does it mean for this candidate, what does it mean for this party. Really, what it's got to be about is the voter. If there's going to be any bias in any of our systems, it should be a bias in favor of the voter, in favor of the citizen. So I'd be interested to know, sort of turning it back to you, about what you've been observing in these last few months at both presidential primary, but also getting ready for the congressional elections as well. And we've seen the two major party conventions. So what do you think that you'll be looking out for and watching this November?
Well, Darren, let me just start by saying I think that the trend lines across the Atlantic are very similar, and that largely the American voting populace is broadly dissatisfied with the choices that the two establishment parties had been giving them. The number one story really just over the summer, of course, is our Vice President Kamala Harris replacing Joe Biden on the presidential ticket. And what's really interesting here is that more than half of what we call double haters. These are the folks that didn't want to vote for either President Biden or a President Trump. They're now supporting Harris. So there's a new energy, I would say, in the presidential election as a result. But this masks what has been that overarching story of the presidential primaries for both major parties. Namely, there's just been so little competition. I mean, for the Democrats, Biden had barely any competition, despite concerns about his age and favorability, and following his presidential debate performance in very late June, which forced the party to reckon with Biden's competitiveness. Harris quickly consolidated delegate support without having to go through a primary process. And then on the Republican side, of course, the GOP field was narrowed down to two candidates. This was just after one state primary, that was Iowa. Despite some concerns within the Republican Party, its leaders were unable to stop the Trump movement through his base, and the former president clinched his pathway to the GOP nomination also very quickly. I think looking forward to November, the number one thing for our partners in the UK to understand is that most states and voting districts don't truly matter when it comes to electing the US president. The election will be very, very close, and it'll come down to maybe a few thousand votes in 6 or 7 swing states. These are in the West, that's Arizona and Nevada. In the South, it's Georgia and North Carolina. In the North and East, it's places like Michigan and Wisconsin and Pennsylvania. And this leads us to the spoiler problem, in which the most decisive states are likely to be won without a majority, with more votes for third-party and independent candidates than the Trump-Harris margin. This means that more voters would have voted against the winner than for the winner in these select swing states, when you don't have an election system like ranked choice voting. So, we saw this. This is a chronic issue in U.S. politics. So for those of you who are watching this, it's the same refrain: Ross Perot in 92, Ralph Nader in 2000, Jill Stein in 2016, and we're on track for another spoiled election. Now, we've just had one of the key independent or third-party candidates step out. RFK Jr. recently announced that he was stepping back and endorsing Trump. But with those candidates who still exist, they're currently taking anywhere from 1% to 3% of the votes in 4 to 5 swing states, where the margin of victory, Darren, is just minuscule. So, bottom line, we need to reform to empower voters so that they're not strategically voting, solve this spoiler problem, and deliver majority winners. And I know that we'll talk about that in a bit. But one last point. You were talking about your House of Commons, and we are at FairVote watching the control of Congress. And again, it comes down to an issue of how is the system really functioning in ways that are responsive to the needs of the people who are being governed. And in that, only 5% of the 435 House seats are true toss-ups. This is the lowest in the 25 years that FairVote has been tracking elections. Most of our representatives are being chosen in the party primaries, not in the general election. And this is because of the partisan drawn districts, which make them uncompetitive as a whole. And when you have, anywhere from 8 to 10% of Americans voting in primaries, these are the voters who are perhaps the most committed to their politics and tend to lean more partisan than not. Candidates to win, they must run to the right or the left to win those votes. So the result, Darren, is that you get leaders elected who are incentivized to pay attention to a partisan minority within their jurisdictions to win and to keep their seat. This is not conducive to governing. It's not conducive to delivering for the American people. It's not conducive to a functioning government. When the system is not able to represent the interest of America's majorities.
It's so interesting and so challenging for us about how we respond to this, because just listening to you explain that, it's just so complicated, and yet people who try and resist reform pretend that the proposals that we come up with are somehow too hard to understand. They're not. We just believe every vote should count, and the rules of the game should be fair. And yet, as you were describing it, just the small number of people in such a large democracy, where the focus goes, how the districting boundaries are drawn, all of these things, how the electoral rules are put together, are about putting a certain number of people at the center of things, but it's not the citizens and not the voters. And it's a reminder of just how important our work is to try and point this out, that if you're explaining this to someone who knew nothing about it, they'd scratch their head and say, why would you do it that way? I think that's true in the United Kingdom, and I think it's true, as I was listening to you, I think that's true of the United States as well, that this is just not fit for purpose anymore. It's past its use-by date. But I was also interested to hear from you about some of the the state initiatives you've got on the ballot this November that are not about particular candidates, but are about potential reforms of the elections systems, and whether you could share with us some of the items that are likely to come up this November in that regard.
No, of course. So that the U.S. presidential election aside, we do have several exciting ballot measures, including at the state level, that FairVote is supporting and tracking. And bottom line, the market is ripe here in the U.S. for electoral reform. So, and we do see this with ranked choice voting, which remains the fastest growing election reform here in the U.S. It's winning on its own. And this November, we will see how RCV can win, including paired with primary reforms. Just to kind of give you a sense of how we're seeing this reform begin to take off. We've grown from about, let's say RCV was in about 10 cities in early 2016 to around 50 cities and counties and states today. RCV is used statewide in Alaska and Maine. And presently there are 7 times more Americans who live in jurisdictions where they can rank their ballot today than did in 2016. And the reason why is because this election reform works. It's simple, it's easy. Once voters use it, they love it. And it delivers what voters want from our democracy. It gives us greater choice, more power and say over who represents us. It makes our campaigns less toxic, and it ensures that our representatives are accountable to a majority of us. They're incentivized to deliver, again, not for that narrow partisan base, but to deliver and serve the needs of at least a majority of their constituents. And all that comes from the simple change to our ballot. So instead of just picking one candidate, voters get to rank their choices 1, 2, 3. And this is the reason why ranked choice voting is beginning to take off. My personal favorite about this reform is that it politically incentivizes elected leaders to deliver on behalf of a majority of their constituents. And I want you to think about that. The number of states that could be using RCV, that could triple this November. So currently we have Alaska and Maine. There are 4 additional states that will have ranked choice voting on the ballot this November. And that is Idaho, Colorado, Nevada, and Oregon. We also have Washington, D.C., and several other cities that will have ranked choice voting on the ballot. So I just want to close by also noting that it's not just ranked choice voting that we're seeing voters begin to pick up and to pay attention to and to question whether this is right for their locality. It's ranked choice voting on its own, and often in tandem with primaries reform or other election reforms that really sort of deepen the impact of what these reforms can do together. This is an important development in the electoral reform space. RCB and RCB plus the pairing of primary reforms. And we see this in, let's say, Idaho and Colorado, Nevada. These three states would adopt an all-party primary along with ranked choice voting if we're successful this November. And then for other states like South Dakota and Arizona and Montana, these are the states that are considering just the all-party primary reform, though we're keeping an eye on Arizona and Montana because eventually their reforms could include ranked choice voting as well. So with that, well, much of our immediate progress here in the U.S. Focuses on ranked choice voting and its single winner form. A lot of your focus at ERS is on advancing proportional representation, Darren. I want you to share with our audience why that is and what do you see as the path forward for proportional representation in the UK in the coming months and years.
Well, thanks, and thanks for sharing those examples as well. It was fascinating hearing you list a lot of those states because it's been drummed in some senses that some are red states and blue states and some of them were battleground states. I think what the reforms that you're pushing for will do is reveal what the true preferences are of voters who live in those areas and also how to give voice to substantial minorities in those states as well, that they might not be the overall political dominant colour for that state, but they still have political views and be able to support other parties and have some representation, or at least have their voices heard in a way that the winner takes all just doesn't allow to happen. It's either red or blue. So we'll be watching that with great interest as time goes on. Well, for proportional representation, it is really this very simple notion that we think of seats being able to match votes, and we just feel that we have a number of centres of power in the UK. There's the Houses of Parliament, which is made up of the House of Commons and the House of Lords. I'll come back to that in a moment. And then there are some fairly powerful devolved settings as well, where the Scottish Parliament has its own Parliament at Holyrood in Edinburgh, the Welsh Senate, which is in Cardiff Bay, and then Stormont in Northern Ireland, as well as here in London, the London Assembly. And and then at local government level, local authorities and councils, there's a lot of responsibilities that they hold. And yet what we've seen and particularly in England with local authorities is that with the majority first past the post system, you get a lot of one party states. So a lot of areas where one party dominates completely, and even if they're popular, they don't need to get 100% of the seats, but that's what the system delivers. And yet where we've seen proportional representation used in Northern Ireland and Scotland with STV at local elections, other forms of PR in Scotland and Cardiff and London, we've just seen a different type of politics that has come through. We've seen more parties being able to be represented, and we've seen both political parties be able to be consistent with what their core views are, rather than try and stretch from left to right far too far to almost tear themselves apart, trying to keep their so-called broad church together. So you get more effective choice for voters because they can look at parties and candidates and independent people and say these are the sorts of people we'd like to see representing us. And it also encourages, if a party is unable to secure over half the vote, it also encourages parties to learn how to work together. And in most walks of life and in most industries and in most personal settings, this comes naturally, working together with people who might be slightly different to you. But in politics, we act as though this is a Mount Everest of a problem under first past the post. And I think proportional representation opens up a way of bringing in more voters because they know they're going to get something for their vote. It forces parties to open up their thinking and to go everywhere, not just concentrate on some geographic areas. It encourages them to recruit a more diverse range of candidates so that our public institutions reflect and look like our communities, when for so often and for so long they haven't, and people are well versed in the statistics on that. So there's lots of good principled reasons for proportional representation, but also good evidence of where we've seen it working as well. And I know we'll come on to that. Where we're at the moment is there has been a change of government, and the new Labour government, a majority government, as I mentioned before, 2/3 of the seats on 1/3 of the vote. They didn't have it in their manifesto of promises to bring in proportional representation, but we're encouraged to continue to work with them to try and persuade them, because inside their own political party and with their trade union supporters, with the labour organisations inside the Labour Party, there's been a substantial change, significant movement to support PR. And so now our next big task is to convince the elected politicians in the cabinet and in the inner government, if you want to put it that way, to try and come on board with it. So there's several ways of doing that. One, we'll put out a big report to explain what the 2024 election means from our point of view, drawing on those volatility themes that we mentioned at the top of the discussion, to show that just because something happened at one election, in a volatile system, the opposite can happen next time as well. So people should not be resting on their laurels thinking we've won big and we're going to be here for a long time. I think politics has fundamentally changed in that particular regard. Secondly, we need to try and centre the need for voting reform and elections changes within a broader conversation about democratic changes more generally. It's no good people like you and me just talking about changing how we count votes and allocate seats. That's very, very important. But we have to find ways of explaining to people the democratic story of what's happening. So there'll be things that the new government are going to take on where we want to try and encourage them. Things like what the franchise age should be for when people can start to vote. How we get people on the register. We've got the same problem that you've got, many millions of people missing from the electoral register. How we can lift voter turnout. Only 60% of people voted in July. We're also looking at other topics like reform of the House of Lords. The new government have said they want to get rid of the 92 seats that go to hereditary aristocrats. We don't even have time for me to explain how that came about, but trust me, it's not a good thing, and the new government is getting rid of it. And then finally, we want to try and help them on things where we think the previous government went in the wrong direction, like on introducing compulsory voter ID, the requirements of which are tougher than many of the American states, which, as you well know, are virtually always introduced for partisan reasons, not for evidential reasons of demonstrated fraud. So if we can work with this new government to support their democratic agenda and push it along the side of talking about the voting system and how to include more voters, listen to more people, then I think we have an opening. But it is a tough task. However, more and more of the evidence is on our side, and we're quite excited about that work.
No, truly, I just want to reemphasize a couple of points, Darren, that you make. I'm still over here shaking my head. 2/3 of seats constitute just 1/3 of the vote in the House of Commons. And with proportional representation at FairVote, we think about it as it's just ensuring that voters are able to elect their preferred candidates in proportion to their voting strength. And for parties, whether it's an RCV or it's a proportional representation reform, PRCV, it really, and you say this, and I think this is a beautiful thing. You said it forces parties to open up their thinking and to recruit, I would just sort of paraphrase here, truly representative candidates. And at FairVote, we see this as not just something that's good for vote. It is absolutely good and fundamental for voters, but fundamentally, when we're talking with political parties, we make the point on how this is good if they want their party to be strong and resilient over the longer term, because you are responsive to the needs of the voters in your districts, regardless of how they are drawn. And that fundamentally is the part and parcel of what a healthy and vibrant democratic system is all about. I do have one question for you. I know that you yourself are a former legislator in New Zealand. I'm just dying to ask you as a practitioner a question there, but I did want to go to an audience question. There have been several questions for you, Darren. First, is there more appetite? Do you see more appetite from conservatives for reform after the July elections? That's question one. And then question two is, how does Labor engage now that they have benefited from the distortions in representation?
They're both great questions. So the Conservative Party of the UK is a very old political party, and it's an election-winning machine. It wins most of the elections that it's contested for the House of Commons. This is one of the rare parliaments where their vote share is actually higher than their seat share. In other words, first past the post has been very tough on the Conservative Party at this election. So we are starting to hear from people who are looking at this again, and saying, well, if politics has changed fundamentally, how do we address this? How do we balance this? Now, parties that are defeated in a serious way often say they're going to be looking at things in a new way, and then quickly go back to the old way of operating. What gives me slight optimism? I mentioned before some of those devolved institutions that have developed in the last 25 years in different parts of the UK. And there are parts of the UK where the Conservative seat share used to be very, very low because they couldn't, under first past the post, win seats. But because they used proportional representation, there's been a base for centre-right voters to have a voice in Wales and Scotland and at the London Assembly. Now, for sure, by no means close to forming an administration in those bodies, but it's right and proper that if 20–25% of an area are centre-right voters, they should have some seats and some representation and some voice. So I think as the Conservatives start to unpick their defeat, they might look at two things. One, they might look at the style and the nature of the way that they governed in the previous decade and a half and the impact that had on public trust. Mm-hmm. How you rebuild, that's very important. And then the second thing, looking at these devolved institutions and saying, when there's PR, we always get a voice, and we can build out from that. And I think that is what makes it a slightly different angle this time from just a regular defeat that the Conservatives might have suffered as they do from time to time. So reasons for optimism there. And then with Labour, yes, of course, right now they have gone from having 4 defeats in a row to this landslide victory. And so there will be a temptation perhaps to say, well, maybe things aren't as bad after all. But I guess what I would say is that's a very high price to pay for the occasional landslide. Normally, in the last 100 years, the Labour Party has lost 2/3 of the elections. They've not led a government after 2/3 of the election. And yet, in various elections, when you consider the various parties and who's more centre-right, centre-left, progressive, conservative, etc., under a PR system, there would have been more than that. So I think that Labour should look at the long term. They should realise that in a number of seats, they have challenges from these other parties where slight movements could turn it around again, and be more open to the idea that if they do want to build a lot of change, one of the industries and one of the parts of society they need to change is politics itself. And it's an urgent matter, and they should be taking that just as seriously as they are talking about with rebuilding the economy.
Truly, and in that, just being authentic about how are they representing the interest of the voters who are voting for them, regardless of whether they're on an upswing, downswing, or getting a landslide, as you just noted. I did want to just remind our audience members, if you have a question for Darren or for me, you don't have to wait for the formal Q&A session. I encourage you just to submit your questions in the chat box, and we look forward to continuing our discussion there. So, Darren, you're a former legislator. You served in New Zealand, which uses proportional representation. And one of the things that we emphasize here at FairVote is that election reforms is just as good for elected officials as it is for voters. If you're going to be embracing a reform that allows you to be responsive to the needs of those that are being governed in your district, it allows our legislative leaders to do the things, or elected leaders to do the things that they came to office to do. I call it the leading and the legislating and the governing, rather than having to be beholden again to the interests of a narrow party base. Can you tell us about your own experience as an MP in New Zealand and how this informs your work with the Electoral Reform Society and how you gauge counterparts?
Sure, no, I'd be very happy to, because I think New Zealand has been a great success story. I mean, New Zealand inherited from the United Kingdom first past the post, and then it just wasn't working. It wasn't suitable for the kind of country that New Zealand became and is becoming. And so over 30 years ago, took the decision to go to proportional representation. And what's so fascinating about that is watching it develop and evolve. I mean, I've worked in it. I was in one of the larger parties, so I by all rights should have been against it, but I could see it working. I like the idea that we could stick to what we thought was important and work with other parties in an open and transparent way. So you'd come to arrangements that would be known about, that you'd share with the public and say, this is what we're going to do working together over this term, and make it something, a program that you were proud of, as opposed to something you were accepting reluctantly. I think that changes the nature of how parliamentarians and political leaders interact with each other. it also changes the way of thinking. If you know that every single vote in the country counts, no matter where they live, because of proportional representation, then that alters the mindset. You're not scurrying around looking to go to just certain areas and talk to certain people. You're out there mounting a full campaign for the country. And I think the other thing that I think is a good sense check is that there's now been 10 general elections in New Zealand under proportional representation, and that's resulted in 5 of the elections resulting in a government of the centre-left party leading it, and 5 for the centre-right. So what it's done is it's really baked in the notion of fairness, as opposed to the more lopsided results that you see in first past the post. I mentioned earlier that the Labour Party wins 1/3 of the time in the last 100 years in the UK, the Conservatives 2/3 of the time. And I think the New Zealand example shows that you can still have very stable public policy making, because the numbers are put out after the election and you negotiate for a majority for your positions across the political spectrum. The diversity of the New Zealand Parliament has turned right around. There are now Indigenous people in all of the political parties. There's been gender parity at points. I think it's just dipped at the last election, but certainly in the last Parliament it was 50% women. The cabinet was 50% women, and so it's brought in different people and made it more of a stable, inclusive, and functioning democracy. So I'm very proud of it, and I use that experience when I'm talking to people, regardless of what party they're from here in the UK, to say that this can work, and it can work really well.
Oh, it's so encouraging to hear. And I think there's a real difference, I find, when you're talking to other practitioners, by taking things out of the academic or the theoretical and say, look, this is how it actually has worked in this country where I served. And this is the kind of outcomes, not just for voters, but how it impacted the way that you and your colleagues worked to represent the folks who were voting for you. So I'm just delighted to have you in the role that you are, Darren, and able to build those pathways with elected officials in the UK as they're looking at this system as a way to reform and make more representative the way that the House of Commons and other elected bodies work. I do see that we have a question from the audience. The audience member says that I live in a very blue state, and my friend expressed concern about ranked choice voting opening a path for more right-leaning candidates to win. And how would I respond to that concern? Well, I think I would say first and foremost that voter views and needs need to be addressed. We are in a society, we all live in societies that are made up of different people and different viewpoints and ideas about how to build our country and our communities forward. And that is a good thing. A strong democracy, I would say, is not made by refusing the other side to have their voices heard. So a system like ranked choice voting would allow for all these voices to be heard, with the key that the election of leaders in ranked choice voting elections, they have to build broad support amongst their constituency. That includes red, blue, and everyone in between. So I would respond by saying the concern should be that, and perhaps we do have extremes because voters don't feel like their views and ideas and their needs are being addressed by the current political system, and that needs to change. As well as we need political incentives that encourage debate and problem solving amongst those who are elected, regardless of their party base. And I'd love to talk a little bit about how we're seeing that work in Alaska. But have no fear. If you live in a blue state or a red state, your democracy is going to be stronger when you allow all voters, all people within your jurisdiction, to have their vote count, and to have their government system be responsive to their needs and their issues. And with that, Darren, I'd love to turn over to you.
Sure, I really endorse what you say there. I think it's we see so much polarization, and that's partly about not understanding or listening to enough voices, and then time goes on, and that polarization gets deeper. So bringing some of these rich differences to the surface, so you can have people working together and understanding, means that you don't have to choose where you go to live based on what the political representation is. You should choose where you go to live because you like the place, and then your vote should count whenever it is election time. I also think there are very strong principled reasons for these causes that we're working on. And individual elections give us good data to look at to help us make the case. But what we can't go down the track of is just looking at one election in isolation and saying, well, what would that have meant for party X or candidate Y there? And then I'll let that decide how I feel about proportional representation, RCV, whatever we want to say in that context. I think it's got to be about the principled approach of it. But I did want to ask you a question. You mentioned Alaska just now, which I know is something of a poster child for election reform in the United States. And I first of all, I'd like to know why that is. But also if you could tell us something about how it's been, how the initiatives that have already been agreed to have been functioning, and what we might look forward to come November.
Oh, Darren, of course. Yeah, so I'm fortunate to have been born and raised in the great state of Alaska. This is the 49th state in the United States, and it's known as something of a frontier state. And it's a place where you have a rich array of known to be a red state, of course, but there's a rich array of political diversity. And what makes Alaskans is their fierce independence. It's a state in which I think, again, because of the elements, Alaskans are of strong mindsets, they are focused on results, but they also look out for one another. And statewide offices in the first ranked choice voting election that was held in Alaska in 2022 really reflect that independent streak and enable a rich array of political diversity amongst Alaskans on who they felt would best represent them. So in that one 2022 election, Alaskans represented one of the most conservative Republican governors in the country with Mike Dunleavy. Alongside, they reelected a moderate Republican in the Senate with Lisa Murkowski. And then they also elected a moderate Democratic Congresswoman in Mary Peltola, who appealed to more Alaskans statewide than her Republican opponents. Now, Mary as well, she is the first Native Alaskan elected to Congress and the first female House representative for the 49th state. But even when you take a look at how RCV is impacting how the state legislature functions in Alaska, this is very exciting for me. And I think for organizations like ours, Darren, there's a real need for research on the sort of legislative benefits or impacts of how these election systems incentivize our leaders to find ways to get things done, is how we would say it here in the States, but make progress where they can on issues that matter to their voters. And we see this very clearly in the Alaska State Legislature. So you've got both houses are controlled by Republicans in the Alaska State Legislature, but the most powerful force for legislating there is a bipartisan caucus of Republicans and Democrats. Now, they don't agree on many issues at all, but they do focus on overlapping interests and areas where they can work together to get things done for their constituents. And this tends to be things like the economy, public safety, education, and of course, a balanced budget. And, for us at FairVote, we think, isn't this what we all want from our elected officials? And isn't this something that would actually benefit voters everywhere, regardless of how your jurisdiction leans politically? Because above the line, what we're seeing here in the States is you've got 85% of Americans currently don't believe their elected officials care what they think. The market is ripe for electoral reform that incentivizes and empowers our elected leaders, again, to lead and legislate and govern in the interest of their constituents. And that is something that we will continue to push for and fight for. But it's also something that's just wonderful to point to the example of Alaska and other RCV jurisdictions where you see an election system that incentivizes this kind of pragmatic problem solving and focus on getting things done rather than being concerned about how you are showing up for a narrow partisan base. So let me see if we have, I think we're well over. Oh, I'm sorry, Darren, go ahead.
I just want to just, I know we're coming to the end. I just wanted to say that you're right about the things being ripe for this. I shared about how in the British Social Attitude Survey, that trust and faith in institutions is at rock bottom, never been so low. So actually any examples where our leaders can try and show their ability to work together, to get things done, to be sensitive and to be listening to people and to be explaining. I think people will respond very, very well to that. But I think if people think that their votes don't count, that makes them unlikely to register or then to turn out if they have registered. And if they see this kind of campaigning behaviour with huge amounts of money being spent on very narrow areas and policies never really changing very much, then I think that demotivates them. So that Alaska example is great, and you can be very, very proud of your home state. It's amazing that the same voters could elect three very different people, but it shows you that voters, it shows you how sophisticated and conscientious voters are, and we shouldn't treat them as though they don't understand these things. They understand them better than a lot of the people who do the talking on politics do sometimes, I think.
No, for sure. And Darren, I think we just have time, if I might, just one more question I'd like to pose to you, and then would be glad to wrap this session with great thanks to you and to our audience members who have joined us. So we have one last question for Darren. Can you talk about the benefits of mixed member proportional representation in New Zealand as opposed to the single transferable vote for the UK or the US?
Sure. So without getting into the technicalities, given where we are in the conversation, to say that these are both what get referred to broadly in the UK as proportional systems. So in Northern Ireland, all elections apart from Westminster use the single transferable vote. In Scotland, at local elections, they use the single transferable vote. We're currently involved in a very big campaign in Wales to try and get local authorities at local government level there to consult their publics and then to choose STV. The mixed member proportional model is used in Scotland, Wales, and London in the sort of the legislature parts of it. It's been the one that New Zealand has used, and I suppose that in New Zealand they've still have one single local representative, but there's a party vote to top up to make sure there's proportionality in the overall group. Whereas single transferable vote, there's not a nationwide list as such, but you're electing a team of MPs or a team of legislators or a team of councillors to cover a defined geographic area. But none of the vote is never. The votes are never wasted because you keep going until it's exhausted by going 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 as well. So they're the two systems that get used in the UK at the present time. And one of the things that we are always have to be very careful about is that sometimes people will choose any random old PR system that they understand works somewhere in the world and says, oh, we couldn't do that because then we'll be like country X. And in fact, with STV, you still get local people from your local area. They might just be a little further away than what they are now, but isn't that better if you have more voices than trying to make it more narrow and closer and therefore shut out a lot of voices as well? So like all voting systems, they have their drawbacks and their pluses, but at the Electoral Reform Society for a very, very long time now, we've been promoting the merits of the single transferable vote.
Wonderful, Darren. Thank you so much. And just to close us out, if you could share with our audience, how can RCV advocates or proportional representation advocates in the UK help keep momentum going?
I think there's probably two ways in that. Well, one is to keep talking about the fact that we recognise the challenges in our democracy. They're there for all to see, the sort of the polarisation, some of the disinformation, some of the ways that we are not very good at including enough people, the lack of inclusivity in our politics, to keep pointing those things out, but to do it in a way that projects it onto a larger democratic story, and also in a way that with a lot of enjoyment and belief and faith explains what the solutions to these things are. And in our case, we're promoting electoral reform as organisations on either side of the Atlantic, because we know that things can be better than they are now. We know that we can link healthy societies, strong economies to good democracies. Those things all fit in together. And if one of them is not doing well enough, then the other ones will suffer. And I think democracy is suffering majorly at the present time. But we've got good reasons to be hopeful for it, because we're seeing both in the behaviour of voters who are making it very clear what they think about things, but also in some of these specific initiatives that are being taken. You've shared many many wonderful initiatives where there's been success at the ballot box for reform of the election system and in the US. And I've just talked about just 3 local authorities in Wales that we're working very, very hard to try and persuade them of the benefits of STV for their local authorities. So there's always great work to be done, but it's got to be rooted in the sense of principle and the fact that we know that if we bring more voices into democracy and we have a more diverse representation of both ideas and people, then that's going to be better off for all of us. And it's definitely worth us fighting the kind of the vested interests who want things to never change. If they keep hold of that, the thing will come tumbling down. We don't want that either. Let's make a positive, open change and reform our democracies to make them worthy of the citizens that they're meant to serve and represent.
Oh, I couldn't have said it better, Darren. And that, for those of you that are looking to get involved, you can support our organizations that are working with local leaders on the ground to get these reforms considered and to build support for these systems being adopted by the voters and elected leaders themselves. Also, here in the US, FairVote, our research, our technical advisory, legal support, communications support is utilized in over 80 localities across 35 states. And I just want to pick up on something that Darren said. What really makes the difference, in addition to providing support for this kind of reform work, is when you show up and you share your interest in a representative electoral system and what that means to you in localities that are authentic to where you live and work, and where you see that the system can better serve voter needs. So you can visit us at FairVote and also with Darren at ERS for more information on where you can get involved. And I just want to say, Darren, it's been so wonderful having time with you this evening. I want to thank you and our audience for coming out today, but also I do want to close with a quote from one of your recent blogs, if I may, and that is that I told you I loved it, and this line really stood out for me. And you had written, "The only bias that an electoral system should have is one toward representation of voters. They, our voters, are the most important part of any election, and the voting system needs to ensure that their voices are heard as clearly as possible by ensuring Parliament accurately represents how they voted." Darren, thank you so much for everything that you do. I'm delighted for FairVote to have such a great ally with ERS. We'll be sure to post the video on our YouTube and social channels in the coming days. Again, that's youtube.com/FairVote and on Twitter @FairVote. So please share with anyone who might be interested or watch it again if you'd like to. Keep an eye out for future videos and webinars from us at FairVote and ERS, and we look forward to seeing you soon. Thanks again for joining us.
Thank you very much. Have a great day and great evening.